Next, we're going to talk about managing conflicts. And the first phase of conflict management is always identifying conflicts. So specifically, we're talking now about the conflicts identified after the elicitation phase, but in general, the conflicts can arise at any point during the requirements engineering process, because stakeholders may change their opinion at any point in time, leading to conflicts, but most conflicts are during the interpretation phase or after the elicitation phase. And it's your task as the requirements engineer to identify the conflicts, because you are pretty much the only person who's involved with all stakeholders and is supposed to have a complete overview of the requirements. Once you identified a conflict, it's time to analyze it. The task is quite difficult, but it's like super important to resolve it, because if you do not understand the conflict, how do you plan to resolve it? And first thing you can do is think about like what type of conflict is it? Is it a subject conflict? Is it a conflict of interest, for example, or a conflict of values? Is it a relationship conflict, structural conflict, or are there many pieces and components part of this conflict? So why and where and how did this conflict appear? And the subject conflict is caused by a deficit of information or false information or different interpretation of the same information. To give you one example, startup time of the system does not exceed 2 seconds, which could mean, or could be in the interpretation of stakeholder A being too slow, or if you maybe have a tech person who could represent stakeholder B, this is infeasibly fast. So you have those contradicting viewpoints that both can cause problems while implementing the system, and you have to resolve that conflict. And as a subject conflict, you have here like a good example for either a deficit of information. Why does it have to be less than 2 seconds? Why is it maybe infeasibly fast? You have to understand this and find a solution to that. Next category would be a conflict of interest. Stakeholders may have different goals, usually due to costs. And as I already told you, usually your customer wants something that would cost way more than what they are willing to pay. Stakeholder A wants to minimize the cost. Stakeholder B desires a high quality system. Usually quality costs more than low budget stuff. So you have to find something in between that makes both stakeholders happy. Conflict of value, not related to monetary values, because we got that question quite a lot in the past, means values in the sense of principles. For example, stakeholder A wants to have an open source system, stakeholder B wants a closed source system. So usually you solve that from a hierarchical perspective, that someone above those two contradicting stakeholders makes a decision for open source or closed source. You could also negotiate something in between, that some parts might be open source, others not. This is why we're now talking about negotiations. Next, we have relationship conflicts. They're caused by stereotypical relationship concepts. For example, I just cannot stand the marketing guys, communication deficits, or negative personal relationships. So stakeholder A and B are of equal importance. Stakeholder A tries to distinguish itself through forcing his requirements onto the project. There are some power dynamics that need to be resolved there. There are different approaches to do that. We'll cover them in a few minutes. Then next are so-called structural conflicts, which are caused by unequal levels of power. Superior rejects all inputs of an employee, no matter what. Important stakeholder A completely rejects opinions and suppresses requirements of a less important stakeholder B. You can of course just accept that, but if you accept that, you risk the support of stakeholder B, because if stakeholder B doesn't have the feeling that whatever he or she says matters, they probably just refrain from any further interactions, because if it doesn't really matter at all, why putting in the effort? Which puts you as a requirements engineer in the difficult position that you might lose important requirements and that you build something that doesn't fit what stakeholder B actually wants, and that the system might not function the way it's supposed to be. So your task is to figure out a way to keep stakeholder A happy because stakeholder A seems to be more important, but also stakeholder B because there is a point why stakeholder B was there or is there in the first place. If stakeholder B was not important at all, you would not have involved stakeholder B in the requirements engineering process. So that's like an example for a structural conflict. And then, as we already said, like there can also be a mix of various reasons where clear classification is not possible. For example, stakeholder A wants open source due to their principles, but also due to the cost objectives. Stakeholder B wants closed source due to their principles and does not care about the potential higher costs. Both conflicts of interest and conflicts of values, but even those examples are super simple and are just here for illustration purposes. It could be way more complicated. Now that you identify the conflict and analyze the conflict and try to understand it to the best of your abilities, it's time to resolve a conflict. How can we resolve them? Most important part of the conflict management is this resolving. Try to find a fair solution that is accepted by all involved stakeholders. As I said, keep them happy. If they are not happy, they will refrain from cooperation. It should involve all relevant stakeholders. You can exclude those that you don't need for this particular conflict. And you can apply various conflict resolution techniques. Once again, this list is not complete. We're just giving you something to work with. We will walk through them like on a high level. If you're interested in more details, there is supporting literature for those. There are definitely other techniques as well, but those that we are listing here are among the most common and those that we think could be very helpful for you when you find yourself in the position of being a requirements engineer. So first we're going to talk about agreements, then a compromise, then voting, definition of variance, overruling, consider all facts, plus minus, and decision metrics. So let's get started. Agreement, probably among the most common and simplest approaches. You have all conflict parties negotiate a solution to the conflict. They exchange information, ideas, arguments, and opinions. And in the end, you hopefully have a result or they agree on a solution that works for everyone. One of the alternatives is selected. So select one of the alternatives, which is important because there is a difference between an agreement and a compromise. That would be the second technique to look at. When you want to get a compromise, all conflicting parties try to find a compromise between the alternative solution. And the difference to an agreement is mix and match different parts of alternative solutions or alternate solutions, possibly a completely new alternative solution. So there is a difference. And there's also often a question that might be asked during the examination: what's the difference between an agreement and a compromise? Next, voting, also super simple. Essentially, you just ask like, who's in favor of what, and then you vote, and the majority decision might work out as a approach. Whether it's just majority or if you predefine that everyone needs to or 75 or 80% or 100% or just 20%, where you put this voting on a scale needs to be predefined before you start voting. If you ask for 100%, then you're probably back to agreement or compromise on the slide before. So what is voting in a nutshell? All possible solution alternatives are presented to the relevant stakeholders. All conflicting parties vote on solution alternatives, and then alternative with the most votes is accepted. Definition of variance is closely related. The system is developed to allow multiple alternatives through configuration. The system directly satisfies the needs of the stakeholders without restrictions, usually associated with higher costs. And another downside is that it often is not feasible to implement that in the first place. If you think back to the conflict that we had a few minutes ago, where one stakeholder wanted a system that is booting in less than 2 seconds, where one stakeholder said, this is even 2 seconds is too slow, and the other stakeholder said this is infeasibly fast. You cannot configure the system to do both. So for this type of conflict, the definition of variance in this scenario does not work. Also, voting would not work. You cannot just vote on the fact that the system boots infeasibly fast. If it's technically not possible to boot that fast, it doesn't matter how often you vote, it just doesn't work. Next, we have overruling. The conflicts are resolved by hierarchical means, which is quite often an approach that you see in larger corporations. The solution of the party higher up in the hierarchy is selected. If both parties are on the same level, a superior or third party decides. It's only advisable if other techniques failed, because this is usually something where you do not get a lot of buy-in from all stakeholders, where the losing stakeholder party then feels a bit left alone. It's not really motivating them to keep working and helping with the project if they know, okay, look, if I have a better idea, it's just overruled by someone up the hierarchy. Next, consider all facts, which is not really a technique by itself. It's more a precursor to the plus, minus, interesting, and decision matrix techniques that we have on the next slides. Get as much information about the conflicts as possible, and then the influencing factors are prioritized and the relevance is determined. Like what leads to those requirements that are conflicting and why are they conflicting? Which then leads us straight to the plus minus interesting technique. It is a support technique, and you try to get the positive repercussions, which you are placing in a plus category, and the negative repercussions that are placed in the minus category. Neither positive nor negative repercussions are placed in an interesting category, and then you can make then it helps you to get an idea where to put this, in which conflicting side to choose or for what reason. So essentially, it helps you to extend and augment the information that you already have, which support you then in a decision to decide how to resolve the conflict. So essentially, when you have it flat and there are you're not quite happy, so you're trying to collect information okay, what are all the good things about that flat? What are all the negative things about that flat? You compare it to another flat that you might looking at, and that helps. It's not a perfect way to resolve that conflict, but it might help you a little bit to see okay, what is all on the plus side, what's on the minus side. It's the way of structuring information that can help you. And then finally, moving on to decision matrix, often built on top of what we just described. It selects relevant decision criteria for the conflict resolution. So you first have to define those. And then you assign a score from 0 to 10 to all alternatives regarding for these criterions. Higher score equals better suited. The highest sum of scores is selected. So we have, let's say, 3 criterions in this example, 3 alternatives, and you grade them on a scale from 0 to 10. Obviously, 0 to 10 is a random scale. You can also do 0 to 5, 0 to 100, 0 to 1 million. Those are just example numbers here. 0 to 10 often makes sense. And then, in this example, alternative 1 wins because 18 versus 17 versus 13 points in the overall sum. When you're done resolving the conflict, it is super important to please also properly document the conflict. The resolution to all conflicts must be documented in a traceable way. First of all, what was the conflict? Who was involved in the resolution? Why was a specific alternative chosen? Because otherwise, problems may occur at later stages again and again, or you find yourself in discussing the same problem again and again. If you can just point back to say, look, we had this discussion before, this conflict was already resolved and you signed off on this as documented in this paper, then you can save a lot of time. It also helps when you have fluctuations in the requirements engineering or development team, because some people might have been part of the original conflict. They remember the whole history, why they made a certain decision, why they considered this fact but not this fact, but then half the team leaves, other people come in, and then there's a loss of knowledge. So essentially make sure to properly document this so that new people joining in also understand why a certain decision was made back then, because something that was completely logical 5 months ago might be crazy now. So just to like exaggerate a little bit. So document them so that you do not have the same discussion twice. And also it helps you with inappropriate conflict resolutions, because sometimes the resolutions are dissatisfying and need to be reconsidered again. And without documentation of the first resolution, you might make the same mistake again.